I play piano. I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at it, but I enjoy playing nonetheless. For a few years, I took piano lessons. I would study a lot of music from the Baroque and classical periods. I studied music by Bach, Mozart, Handel, just to name a few. This was part of the curriculum, but I also chose a few pieces of my own that I studied. The pieces I chose for myself were usually folk songs from the early to mid 20th century. One song I particularly enjoy is called Yellow Bird. It was originally a Haitian folk song from the 19th century called Chacon, but it was adopted to English as Yellowbird in 1957 when calypso music became popular in the United States. When I played this song for my piano teacher, she said to me, "You like a lot of really old songs." I replied to her, "They're not nearly as old as Bach or Handel." She paused for a minute and replied, "You're right, I never thought of it like that." Why do you think that was? Why does she perceive songs that came out in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s as really old songs, but not songs that came out in the 1730s? She knew music history. She obviously knew how old Baroque and classical music was, but she didn't think of it as old in the same sense that she thought of songs released 200 years later as old. Here's why. Songs that came out 10 or 20 years before she was born seem old to her because that's within her historical frame of reference. She was about 50 years old, so her frame of reference in which she perceives time is probably about one lifetime. So a song that's 80 years old seems old to her, but music that's 280 years old is outside of her frame of reference. Obviously she knows it's old, but she can't really relate to that amount of time, so it doesn't give her the same reaction. But why was I able to conceive of music from the Baroque era as being much older than something from the 1950s? It's because I've expanded my historical frame of reference. And anyone that wishes to oppose the current political order in the West should do the same thing. Expand your frame of reference. Think long term. When you look at history and the effect that it has had on the present day, don't only look at your own lifetime or even the past century. You need to look centuries into the past at the structures that governed civilization. And when deciding what system you want to govern civilization in the future, don't only think about the next 4 years or even the next 10 years. Think about what will be best for the next century and beyond. The problem is that modern society has a very short-term frame of reference. Our perception of history only really begins around the First World War. We see time before that as being so old that it isn't even relevant anymore. Black Pigeon Speaks made a video where he pointed out that the foundation myth of the modern West was the period between 1914 and 1945. This idea cements in our minds that egalitarian liberal democracy is the norm in the West, since it has been the dominant system since World War II when the current foundation myth was created. Other forms of government seem completely alien to present-day Westerners, since they existed outside their frame of reference. This is also where we get the narratives associated with the 1960s. In the accepted interpretation of our history, we see the 1960s as the decade where we defeated racism and sexism and created a more tolerant society. Now those attitudes are associated with a distant past which we've long since done away with. And I think this is the view of the world that led Francis Fukuyama to proclaim the end of history in 1992, just after the Cold War had come to an end and liberalism had triumphed over communism. It was the idea that liberal democracy was the pinnacle of human development and that this form of government was going to spread from the West to the rest of the world. Now, most would agree that Fukuyama's assertion of the end of history was premature, but the belief of liberal democracy being the best possible system remains. The belief in the West today seems to be that we just need to do a little more to fully achieve a free, equal, and open society. This is the historical narrative that formulates progressivism today. We see the changes of the past 100 years as positive, and that present-day problems are the result of recent events that can be easily fixed in the current system. It seems to affirm the Whig interpretation of history that society seems to be constantly becoming more enlightened. This short-term perception of history lends itself well to the progressive view of the world. When looking at only the last 100 years, it seems that egalitarian liberal democracy is a system that works. And from this point of view, the new dissident right appears to be this demonic force that goes against everything the modern West views as good. Someone that only looks at the post-war era could easily dismiss the problems that the far right is assessing today. If you've seen my videos on the new narrative for the right, this would be the frame of reference of someone that might reject the critiques that I made. I'd like to show how this short-term view of history is flawed and how much damage has really been done to Western civilization in a short period of time. But when one looks beyond the past century to the past 2, 3, or 4 centuries and beyond, they will find it a lot harder to be a progressive and a lot more appealing to be a reactionary. What are some of the societal problems that I and other reactionaries have addressed in the past? Demographic shifts, low birth rates, broken family structure, short-sighted leadership, cultural deterioration, lack of social cohesion, nihilism. All problems that could be easily dismissed by someone with a short-term frame of reference that doesn't look beyond their own lifetime. But once you realize historically how recent and how fast these problems have developed, does your belief in the current liberal democratic system in which they developed begin to waver? Because when you look at the long-term civilizational effects of liberalism, a reactionary view of the world makes a lot more sense. Let's take a look at traditional values, for example. Traditional family values were the norm for thousands of years until the sexual liberation movement, in which the idea that the purpose for sexuality and relationships went from being about reproduction to being about emotion and pleasure. Now, I and many others have pointed out the problems this brought about many times, but what people often don't recognize is how historically fast these problems developed. I'm not going to go into the data right now because I and many others have done this in previous videos. I'll link it down below. But I want to stress how instantaneous the negative effects of the move away from traditional values were. We've pointed out the problems of unsustainable low birth rates, extremely high divorce rates, extremely high child illegitimacy rates before, but what people often fail to realize is that all these problems developed over the course of only 50 years. That's less than one lifetime. The reason we don't see these as big societal problems is because within our own lifetimes, they've been the norm. But historically, up until only a few years ago, the West has never had these problems. Not in the 18th century, not in the 19th century, or even the early 20th century. Up until the 1960s, monogamy was the norm, divorce and illegitimacy were rare, and birth rates were at a healthy replacement rate. So historically, current family issues are an extremely new societal problem, and the severity of these problems has been brought about rapidly. It's also worth mentioning that these ideas justified same-sex marriage, then transgenderism, then preferred gender pronouns, and saying gender doesn't exist in only 2 decades. I wonder what they'll justify next.
According to current research, pedophilia is an unchangeable sexual orientation.
Another concept that we perceive as normal but is actually historically recent is the idea of tolerance and equality. That everyone in society is an equal blank slate and that they are interchangeable. This idea came about in the 1960s and is seen as a long-lasting ideal of a liberal democratic society, that we're against racism and sexism as much as possible. A progressive today might say that we need to make Western society more tolerant and inclusive. A classical liberal today might say that we are a tolerant society and that intolerance is now being brought back. Both view tolerance and equality as something that's good and that it's been a value for a long time. But the reality is that it's an extremely recent idea. Though it might be called racist and intolerant today, the idea that society must sustain its majority population was the norm for centuries. Britain was for the British, France was for the French, Italy was for the Italians, and the lands that Europe colonized were being developed into nations for the settlers. This was the idea these nations had at their inceptions, and the states that preceded them had the same. And outside the West, this is the norm to this day. This became known in the 19th century as nationalism, and it manifested itself as the nation-state. But it's derived from the much older phenomenon of tribalism and in-group preference. This is seen as intolerant by the modern Western democracies, but historically, prior to the Second World War, this was the norm. Nations protecting their dominant population was just part of civilizational defense. It was only a few decades ago that the West decided that people are just these blank slates and that they could bring in anyone and it would make no difference. And what has the result been? Tolerance has been a one-way street. The white majority that decided upon this only a few short decades ago is now vilified by the universities and the media in their own countries. The more tolerant they become, the more they get called racist. It's now commonplace to see the media put out rhetoric like this.
The uncomfortable truth is that the white race is the most violent and oppressive force of nature on Earth.
And closely linked to the idea of tolerance and the blank slate is demographics and mass migration. I've covered demographics before, so I'm not going to go into the stats here. I can provide some down below. But what I want to stress is that demographic shifts have happened extremely rapidly. At this rate, it will only take Western European countries 1 century from the 1960s to about 2060 for the native populations to go from 95% of the population to less than 50%, which is insane considering they've inhabited these lands for thousands of years. To have your political establishment give away your homeland in only 1 century is ridiculous. The same could be said for the lands that Europeans colonized, though it's been a shorter period of time. I've said this in previous videos, but I'll say it again. If for all of history up until 50 years ago, people were so-called unenlightened and intolerant, then only a few decades after allegedly becoming tolerant, they're being vilified in their own countries whilst being demographically replaced. Maybe there's a reason people were so ethnocentric for all of history, and this idea of tolerance doesn't really exist. Lastly, we can look at the problem of nihilism. I've pointed out in the past how materialist the West is in the present day, but it hasn't always been like that. It was just over a century ago that Nietzsche wrote God is Dead in the 1880s, but for most of history, Western civilization was an extremely spiritual and deeply religious civilization. For over 1500 years, the West was a Christian civilization. For a long time, Western civilization was referred to as Christendom. It was only in the 20th century that it became largely secular. It has been said that the era between 1914 and 1945 was when the West lost its self-confidence. That's outside the scope of our lifetimes, and our frame of reference doesn't go beyond that point, but again, this is a historically recent development. Just prior to the First World War, only 1 century ago, Western civilization was at its height during one of my favorite historical eras of the 19th century, the Age of Nationalism, when European man believed in himself and his civilization, where it meant something to be a Frenchman or an Englishman or a German or an American. It wasn't just a citizenship, it was a deeply held cultural identity. I know I use this example a lot on this channel, but look at art and architecture. Look at the difference between modern architecture and architecture of the 19th century or the 18th century. Likewise, compare abstract art of the present day to pre-20th century art. There is no question which one is better. What I want to stress is how fast this cultural decay has been. We are only a few generations removed from the beauty created in the 19th century. But in just over a century, we've lost this passion we've had for our civilization. People living in the present day aren't really able to conceptualize the problems with modernity that reactionaries often point out because they've existed for the entirety of their lives. But when you expand your historical frame of reference, you can really see the extent of the problems and how fast they've developed. So we've established a frame of reference to interpret the past through. But what about a frame of reference to plan for the future? As we've established, this civilizational crisis has developed very quickly, and it has developed under a political system that, like these problems, is historically recent. We see egalitarian liberal democracy as this universal and absolute good today in the West. And since it's the only system most of us have ever lived under, we can't conceive of anything as a legitimate alternative. But liberalism is a creation of the Enlightenment. It was first introduced in the 18th century, but took another century to fully implement. But the more egalitarian liberalism of the present day, built on the idea of the blank slate, only came about after the Second World War, only 70 years ago. And over that time, we've seen all these civilizational ills come about rapidly. Because it's a short-term oriented system. It's run by politicians with only the next 4 years in mind, whose goal is only personal political gain, and whose interests only extend to the end of their political career. I often hear people assert, and it brings my blood to a boil when they do, that liberalism is Western civilization, and that our fight should be to preserve liberalism, and that whoever's against liberalism is against Western civilization. This couldn't be further from the truth. Liberalism is only a political system, but Western civilization is something much older and much more profound, and that is what our fight is truly for. And as it stands today, liberalism is a system that is incapable, and I'd also argue uninterested, in solving the civilizational crisis that we find ourselves in. And we can assure ourselves that if nothing changes, these problems will get a lot worse. Historically, civilizations were built, sustained, and flourished not under egalitarian rule, but under hierarchical rule. The norm for most of history was monarchy or some sort of aristocracy, and it worked in that it was a system that was long-term oriented and capable of bringing a civilization from one century to the next. In the present day, reactionary ideas such as hierarchical rule, traditionalism, nationalism, and anti-egalitarianism are only seen as far right because of the skewed short-term frame of reference that we view the world through. Though if you look at history over the centuries, reactionary positions are not radical at all. They're just healthy civilizational defense. Lastly, I want to look at one more modern sensibility that really embodies this short-term frame of reference that we have today. It's the notion that you shouldn't be proud of the achievements of your ancestors because it wasn't you that did it, and that you shouldn't be concerned with a century in the future since you won't be alive to see it. Contemporary society very much lives by this attitude, mostly due to nihilism, but I often hear people say that we should live by this. That we shouldn't care about the distant past and that we shouldn't care about the distant future. I often hear this from progressives or from self-proclaimed individualists. Even Jordan Peterson has said this before.
Well, you stand up and wave your flag and talk about your ethnic identity or your racial identity and you take pride in that. It's like, what the hell did that have to do with you, you goddamn loser?
The problem is that this idea is completely modernistic. Suggesting this in any other historical era up to the last few decades would have been completely absurd, because civilization is a long-term process. It transcends generation after generation, century after century. There's a saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. It's true. Rome wasn't built in a day, or a year, or even a lifetime. It took centuries to build the Roman Empire. Had the Romans said, "Why should we be proud of Rome? We didn't build it," would they ever have made the sacrifice to make Rome the great empire that it became? Would each generation have fought to pass on Rome to the next until the empire came to its end? So in the present day, why should you care? Well, this civilizational crisis we find ourselves in will catch up to us very soon. If you are under 40, you can expect these societal ills to come back and bite us well within your lifetime. And for future generations, it will be all they will ever know. If Western civilization is to live to see the 23rd century, there must be a restoration of a stable, healthy, long-lasting societal order. So ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to spend the majority of your life in? What kind of world do you want to leave to your descendants? And how do you want history to remember you? If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter, link in the description. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.